So let me pick up where I left off. What I've covered so far is IPv6, static and dynamic. Talking about direct access, so as I mentioned in Windows 7, we'll talk about a way that you can actually get done. I'm right now focused initially on you set up a workstation, your Windows 7, it goes through, gets an IPv4 address at a Starbucks or whatever. It runs through the stack. It finally creates this encapsulated IPsec encrypted communication stream back out to a direct access server. And that direct access server is plugged into your corporate network. So that way you can get access to your system. Direct access uses IPv6 for all its routing. And that's why I say this is kind of like the first real IPv6 application that you can use, is it communicates and finds its servers based on IPv6. You have your two options of the gateway. You can either use a direct access server, which is running Windows 2008 or 2008 R2. It's just a kind of a router gateway, two network adapters, one on the outside, one on the inside. Or you can use a UAG server, which Microsoft calls. The Windows 7 direct access client, you want to make sure you can ping internally before you then take that Windows 7 client and go externally to a Starbucks. If you can't ping internally, you get that transmit failure. That means your IPv6 isn't set up right. And the minute you move it outside, it's still not going to work. And so some very basic functions of once you get IPv6 working internally and you can ping internal stuff, then you can go through and set up one of these direct access servers and move your workstation outside. Implementation environment. In order for you to be able to run direct access, your Active Directory has to be on Active Directory 2008 Service Pack 2 or higher. And the reason is that it uses functionality built into native mode groups for universal access. It uses IPv6 natively. It uses policies that are specific to SP2. You only need one domain controller. Theoretically, you can have an environment, bring in an AD 2008 Service Pack 2 domain controller and identify that as the domain controller that direct access hits. So you don't have to get everything to Active Directory 2008 Service Pack 2 or higher, but at least one domain controller needs to be 2008 Service Pack 2. It uses certificates. The way that Active Directory will know that this device, this Windows 7 device, is authorized when it's sitting at a Starbucks is that you put a certificate on the direct access server, you put a certificate on the Windows 7 client, they communicate in-house, the person moves out of house, the way that it validates that it's still a valid system is it checks the certificate. So it uses Active Directory Certificate of Authority. The server that's running this direct access thing is a Windows 2008, typically R2 server. You can do it on Windows 2008. The client needs to be Windows 7 Enterprise or Ultimate. This comes with your Enterprise agreement. It will not work with Windows 7 Home Edition. It doesn't work with Windows 7 Professional. It requires either the Enterprise, which comes with the Enterprise agreement, or you can buy the Ultimate Edition, which also supports direct access. And then you just need application servers, web servers, SharePoint, Exchange, your Unix server, whatever it is, you need applications on back end. So what I'm going to be demonstrating here is I have effectively my internal network, which I have Active Directory. It's called DC1 is the name of the server, and it's just a DNS Active Directory 2008 server. I have my web server here, which is also my file server. I have this direct access server, which I have two NICs in there. I have one that plugs into my internal network, and I have one that plugs into the external network. So my 192.168.3 is my internal subnet, and then my 12.155.166 is my public network. I'm going to take this direct access client, which is running Windows 7, and it's going to be plugged in here, and I'm going to access this server. I'm going to configure the direct access server, and then I'm going to basically plug this system over here into this public network, and without making any changes, that system will still be able to access my server here, as well as file shares and things about internally. There is a thing that we're going to set up called a network location server, an NLS server. The way that the Windows client knows that they're inside or outside is that it actually looks for this NLS server. It actually goes out to a URL that you create. In this case here, https nls.companyabc.com. When it can actually hit that server, it knows it's inside. So the minute that it's over here, if it doesn't see that NLS server, it will basically go through and fire up the direct access client and create a VPN into my corporate network. So the good thing is that NLS is the thing that it identifies as being whether I'm inside or outside, but if that server's down, your Windows 7 workstations now, even if they're plugged in the internal network, actually go out of your network and back in. So it's kind of weird. So you've got to make sure this is highly available. We typically just put this NLS on a domain controller, and we have a couple of them out there, and we do domain controller replication. So key to make sure that that thing works. From a security standpoint, there's 3 ways I can go through and set up a direct access server. I could do what they call end-to-edge security. In that case there, my direct access server sits on the internet in my DMZ. My workstations do encrypted 128-bit to the direct access server, but once they hit the direct access server, it can communicate non-encrypted to any of my servers on the inside. So this is the easiest way to do it. I usually suggest when you set it up the first time, do this end-to-edge, because that way your servers don't have to use IPsec, you don't have to do anything fancy on the systems. It just accesses a direct access server. If you want better security, what's called end-to-edge with end-to-end IPsec means that I get access through this with IPsec, but then I enable IPsec on all of my servers, and now when it hits this, I also have IPsec encryption to each one of these servers here. Same function, just better encryption inside my network. IPsec, and what that does, it creates an individual tunnel to every one of your internal servers. I use a combination. I use a combination of end-to-edge, so that way my users hit this, and then they can hit Exchange and SharePoint and all this stuff on the back end. I don't necessarily care, because once they hit this internal stuff is internal stuff. I don't care whether it's encrypted or not once it's inside the network. But I do have 2 applications that I actually go through and do an end-to-end IPsec, and this is for my accounting software and for my HR software. And so when my HR person gets access to it, she has access to everything like Exchange and SharePoint and stuff, just end-to-edge. But when she accesses our HR software, she actually creates an individual tunnel. She doesn't have to create it. It's all automatically done. I configure this server, and its tunnel is automatically created, so that way they have a one-to-one encrypted tunnel for the system. I'll show you those. They're just checkboxes as you configure this thing from end to edge. Okay, so let me go through and walk through the process of configuring this thing. And as I mentioned, all the stuff is downloadable and configurable. /config/global query block list wpad. What this does is it's going to go through, and I run this on every one of my domain controllers. And what this does is it opens up effectively ISOTAP. It basically says I'm going to create this ISOTAP tunnel for any of my systems as the default. If you don't do this, then ISOTAP is not enabled. So effectively, I set up ISOTAP. The next thing I'm going to go through and do is go into Active Directory. So I'm going to go to AD, users and computers. And I'm going to create a group, and I'm going to call this Direct Access Authorized Computers. I'm going to make it a universal group. And in that Direct Access group, I'm going to add computers. And I add in right now WS3, which is the Windows 7 workstation I'm going to be creating. So effectively, you could, what you'll find when I go through the configuration is that you can go into the direct access tool and name specific computers, but if I just go through and create an AD group, I can now just drop computers into this thing. It makes it a whole lot easier, so that way I don't have to configure it one by one. All I have to do is just make sure they're a member of this group. We actually, internal to our business, is all of our salespeople by default are direct access enabled, so when I create a group, they become when I drag and drop an employee into a group, I know that a salesperson is going to have direct access by default. So you can do it that way as well. So I've created a group for that. The next thing that I need to be able to do is open up firewall ports. There's 2 ways that I can do this. I can go into Control Panel, System, Firewall, and I can go through and set up settings and set up all these inbound and outbound rules at the firewall level for every single server and every single direct access workstation. Or in this case here, I'm going to create an Active Directory group policy. And so I'm going to create a group policy, and I call that Direct Access GPO. Edit that policy. And within that policy, when it's setting the security, and I'm going to go to the Windows firewall. an inbound rule, and I'm going to create a new rule. And it's a custom rule for all programs, and I want ICMP echo enabled. And what we'll do is allow effectively ICMP for IPv4, so I'm going to call this inbound ICMP v4. And create another rule, also a custom rule for ICMP v6. And I'm going to allow echo for that. And allow the connections. Name. Call this inbound ICMP v6. Now I have an inbound and outbound for IPv4, IPv6. I'm going to go to outbound rules and create a new rule. Custom. And this is where people do get hung up, and I'll show you in a second here. So ICMP, same thing, echo. Next. Now what you'll find is that this is where people kind of get screwed up. In the past, in the incoming, it allowed by default, but in outgoing, it actually blocks by default. And if you don't actually click this, you will go through and zip white paper, and it's not going to work. And because you did it once and twice, and then the third time you thought it was the same, you got to make sure you click on allow the connection. And this is outbound ICMP v4, and then same thing, an outbound rule. Custom program ICMP v6 echo. Allow connections and outbound ICMP v6. So I've now created 2 outbound rules and 2 inbound rules. I'm going to go to my Windows 7 workstation here. And if I go in and look at my firewall rules on this Windows 7 workstation, advanced settings, inbound rules, I have the default inbound rules and the outbound default rules. These are all grayed out up here, and these are the ones that have been enabled. To set up policy apply, 2 things. One, I can wait 90 minutes. Well, 3 things. I can wait 90 minutes for policy volume to apply. I can log out of the system. Or I can just do a GP update. So in this case here, I'm going to force them to do a GP group policy update / force. And what it does is I'll go off my domain control and bring down the policy. So for when you configure this in your environment, if you're impatient, user certificates and then for all the main computers, we go to request handling and we allow that key to be exported. And so now it's gone through and it will create a user chip cert and a computer cert. Go back to my Active Directory certificate server here. Computer and bring down thing. I'll call this cert for click on my certificate container. I have one certificate in here right now for this DA1 server, and it's a 2010 certificate, something I created when I created the build for it. Is that since I created that as a group policy, again, I'm going to do a GB update/forms. It's going to bring down the policies. It's going to do two things. One is going to set the firewall policies, so I'm going to kill two birds with one stone here. It's going to bring down the firewall policy and open up the firewall policy for this direct access server, and it's going to go through and bring down a server cert. Now, go back to the server container. This one, this is the just got issued today. So I've now created a server cert for that container as well. So automatically enrolled. Now with the firewall ports open, IPv6 running, certificates effectively issued to my workstation, to my server. Install the direct access feature. Direct access is enabled, is running on a computer by default because it's using nothing more than IPv6 as a policy. So that's what it's going to install. Should have access through this direct access server, and I called that direct access authorized computers. Click finish. Second thing I click is step 2 is what is the internal address. Direct access server is the internet and my internal network. It now notes the certificate. So what is the certificate for this, that issued to the workstation? So we'll grab the and the server cert. So that now knows that it has a root certificate and the certificate that the workstation is from. 3, basically looking for the NLS server, the network location server. I'm going to go through and say, go find me my network location server. And now it's going to go through, it takes a couple of seconds here, to validate that that NLS server exists. If it doesn't, it's going to come back and say, the highly available server is not highly available right now, and I'm not going to configure it. Found it. Direct access server, my domain, my IP address, I'm going to have it fall back to DNS as the addressing. If I use SCOM, System Center Operations Manager, I put my SCOM address so it can report. At this point, I don't have SCOM set up, but it has some really nice reporting to let you know when somebody logged into direct access, if somebody's having an IPv6 problem. This is where I added, in my case here, I added my HR server, my accounting server. By default, edge. That's the simplest configuration. I always say, go to now, a couple of tricks. If you hit finish first, it actually configures it without any some address. And HTTP, DC1. Now I'm on the outside network. Establish a connection through the direct access server. I don't have to put any of my web servers or anything out on the internet. This is now just a workstation sitting out on the internet using an IP4 address with an IPv6 address back here. Connecting the tunnel automatically to the direct access server with all of my internal. Okay, but anyways, there it is. My enterprise is now mapped to DC1, C$, for whatever reason. It took a little while. I think it was negotiating the address. It's on the network, so it's like a VPN. So if I do a ping DC1, it's going to go through and ping out to the outside port right now in that particular configuration. So what it does is for any of the addresses, it actually sees it as a device right on the internet with that address. So single hop. So it doesn't. It's seeing the outside port of where I'm at and open the device internally. So that's direct access. Now I did in 15 minutes, which will, if you take it home and do this, it's going to take you a day or two to set the stuff up and get it working and all that stuff. I've done this once or twice before. I can zip through the configurations, but all of the settings and configurations are in this downloadable, and all the step procedures are in the demo guide here of what the steps are. Technically, direct access is, the reason why I wanted to show you it is as you go through these configuration steps is that there's things that if you just kind of click through too quickly, it'll hose it up. And the other rule that I find in setting direct access, go through and do a configuration before you go through the next thing you do that it's not working, direct access. A lot of times even like where this is firing immediately. Route. It has to set up all the routing. So a lot of times what happens is a reboot will make sure all of these occurs. So enabling IPv6 in the enterprise, I set up that NLS server, I set up the direct access with that. I set up my direct access server with the Echo configuration. Running through this little step. And like I said, sometimes reboot the system, force GP update. In many cases, you just reboot the darn thing and everything works. Testing it internal for direct access. To be able to make sure the thing works, you can go through and check to make sure that your IP addresses work and that you can ping. Again, if you get that communication error on a ping, it's not going to work when you go to direct access. You'll also find on every one of your workstations, in this case here, when you click on monitoring on the direct access server, it will tell you which protocol is running. So remember, 64. HTTPS. And you can actually see how are your remote workstations communicating and what protocols are going. And when you click on the details, communicating, how long long they've been online, what their remote IP is. So, as I mentioned, there's two ways you can set up the server, either as a direct access server or what Microsoft calls a forefront access gateway. So direct access uses nothing more than Windows 2008, in this case R2 Service Pack 1. The cost of setting it up is nothing more than just setting up a standard edition Windows 2008 server, $300, $400 server in your DMZ with one port in. This gateway is a $2,500 server. Why would you pay $2,500? The way that the configuration is identical. The difference is direct access out of the box supports Windows 7 clients only, or Windows 8 clients. And it communicates only with IPv6 devices on the back end. So I don't have to have encryption, IPsec, but I have to have my Exchange server set up with IPv6. I have to have my SharePoint server set up with IPv6. So if you've already gone down the path of getting IPv6 set up for Exchange and SharePoint and domain controllers, then out of the box, Windows 7 to Exchange, SharePoint, OS. If you haven't gone through and set up your back-end server to IPv6, you're running Exchange 2003, maybe you just don't want to screw around with SharePoint on IPv6 and you want it to hit IPv4 servers, just put a UAG server here. That way your Windows 7 clients go through UAG and hit either IPv6 or IPv4. So from a simple standpoint, this also helps if you have like SANs that are only IPv4 addressed, because instead of going through and giving your SANs IPv6 SAN addresses, this allows you to take it, because again, direct access natively is IPv6 only. So UAG makes it easier. Or the other reason that you put UAG in place is that if you have non-Windows 7-based systems. If you're running Vista or XP, Macs, or iPads, UAG, we typically find that 80-90% of the time organizations put UAG here instead of direct access just because it takes that simple and makes it simpler by having effectively no worries about what type of device here or what type of device over here. Configuration. So as much as I kind of walk you through the step-by-step procedures, everything is 100% identical. Got to set the groups, got to set the firewalls, got to set the certificates. But instead of sitting on the direct access server and going through step 1, 2, 3, 4, you click enable, and all that stuff, you run this on the UAG server. And the UAG server, the questions are exactly the same, the interface is exactly the same. You basically, from this step, just answer the questions here. So the configuration is exactly the same. There's no configuration changes for Macs or Linux or IPv4. You just run through this, and the remote devices have access to it. And as I mentioned, if you want to do that end-to-end access when you get to step 4, into this little box over here, you basically, instead of saying end-to-edge disabled, you basically say, I want to do end-to-end. And it basically gives you the full-on end-to-end configuration, and you can specify what servers do you want people to do encryption on. If you're having problems on your workstation, so your laptop is working great, IPv6 inside your network, you take it outside, and it's not completely working. If you actually tell you whether your IPv6 is working properly, and then it's routing. So this is a kind of a quick way of going through and looking at that you have a session that's established. If at any point one of these things shows up as disabled, that means that you have an IPv6 error. You can actually go through and click on the help. It'll tell you that you have an IPv6 error, or you have a certificate error, or something on that. That's direct access, something to be able to fiddle around with in your free time if you want to play with something that's an IPv6 app. So, kind of rolling back to the start of the session, what's it take to cut over to IPv6? 10-step process. The first thing that we always typically say is get your IPv6 block of address. Typically from your internet service provider, AT&T, Sprint, whoever you have, or go to Aaron and get your own IPv6, but you need a block of IP addresses. Pick your internal addresses. So this will be your ULA, something that you want as your internal side that you'll set to your DHCP server. It's the same map that you have today that has all of your IPv4 servers. web server, www, and all that stuff, your intranet with IPv4 addresses, associate static IPv6 addresses on paper, identify what your internal DHCP zones and addresses are. Exchange is working, SharePoint is working. You know that your router is set up with that other configuration, and you can route, then set up DHCP. The reason I always say make sure all this works before you do DHCP is that if this stuff's not working and then all of a sudden you configure DHCP, DHCP is great. It sends IP addresses to every device. The bad thing is if you send bad IP addresses to every single device, every device stops working, right? Because again, everything's always trying to communicate from this bad DHCP v6 address that you gave it, and all of a sudden none of your devices communicate. So make sure turn off IPv4 on some of your devices and see if you can actually natively communicate company-wide IPv6. SharePoint server, a file server, and see if you have native IPv6 to IPv6 working before you configure this. And once you configure this, boom, it goes out and sends an IPv6 address out there and you're done. Access. When you get to this, the scary thing is that today you have no DHCP IPv6 addresses. Configure it, everything has an IPv6 address. And hopefully it's a good IPv6 address that works. Migrating. Step-by-step guides, but they actually have some good migration tools. Here's an example. One of the tools that can provide you actually will migrate your DHCP scopes and leases from, say, a Windows 2003 or Windows 2008 DHCP to a new Windows 2008 RT. For example, if you have Windows 2, how many of you are running DHCP on Windows 2003 today? Still? A handful of you still? So the way that you typically would get rid of that old 2003 DHCP server is that you will set the lease to expire after like an hour or two, and that way it issues new leases. You bring in a new server, and then when you drop this server, this one starts reissuing IP addresses. You kind of have that this had addresses, this has no addresses. But if you actually use this migration, bring in a new Windows 2008 R2 server, you set up DHCP, and it actually will scrape all of the IP addresses, all of your scopes, and all of your leases, and brings it up on the 2008 or 2008 R2 server. And so you can walk through. Windows 8. So I'm writing right now in book of Windows 8 that we looked at for the last year and a half. We've been killing Windows 8 in production environments for the last 12 months. This book will be out next summer with Windows 8. Direct access will continue in Windows 8. Today, we're going to have to actually go through and create a certificate, issue a certificate to my direct access server, those certificates on my workstations. If I do Windows 8 to Windows 8, direct access to a Windows 8 client, then because all your systems natively use kernels and work for authentication, you're going to never have to issue a certificate. If that load balance this server today, I can have one direct access server in the box. If that direct access server dies,
2008 like that, actually just before the whole government servers actually look out. Correct. So I got Asia, music connect here. They fly Tokyo, they plug in, they can actually get the team server in Tokyo. So that's something that you can do today with Hiroshi. And you can do today with Microsoft private database. You don't have to buy outlining up the chapter, things like that. That's one of the things. Anybody who needs assistance on this? 65% of you have worked with. Some of you are new. Hyper-V, System Center, Windows 7. We do a lot of stuff with Mac integration, iPhone integration, policies on mobile devices, environment. We typically work with technologies 2 to 3 years before they ship. Sometimes we're able to write a book on Windows 8 until we have before the product ships. I'm already writing a book on the entire 612 product line, so all of Microsoft systems are coming out. I'm writing a book right now on experience. So if I do get a chance to work far in advance, because of the choice, what you work with doesn't work, IPv6